Most people watch Rick Sanchez and see a genius who simply stopped caring. The jokes, the burping, the endless bottle of liquor, all of it reads as a man who decided nothing was worth taking seriously anymore. That reading has stuck for years now, but One Dimension in the Multiverse tells a very different story about what Rick actually stopped himself from feeling. In this video, we break down every nihilistic trait of Rick Sanchez. The Cronenberg abandonment. Consequences are someone else's problem. Rick Sanchez destroys an entire planet in the 6th episode of the first season, and by the next morning, he has already moved on. Not moved on emotionally, moved on physically, into a different universe, with a different version of his own family, sleeping in a different version of his own bed. The episode is called Rick Potion Number 9, and it is one of the clearest windows the show ever opens into how Rick actually thinks. Not what he says about the universe, what he does when the universe stops working the way he wants. The setup is small and almost sweet. Morty has a crush on a girl at school named Jessica. He asks Rick for help getting her to notice him, and Rick, instead of offering any kind of normal advice, builds a device that can manipulate love itself. He calls it a love potion, though it works more like a virus that rewires how people feel about somebody. Rick sprays it near Jessica, and for a moment, it works exactly as planned. She becomes interested in Morty. It looks like a win. Then it spreads. The love potion was never built to stay contained to one person. It jumps from Jessica to another student, then to more people, then to the entire school, then out into the town, and finally across the whole planet. It moves the way a sickness moves, city to city, until every human being on Earth has been infected by it. Rick's fix for a middle school crush becomes a global event within a single day. This is where the episode could have simply been a story about a plan going wrong. Instead, it becomes something much darker, because the love potion does not just make people fall in love with the wrong targets, it mutates them. Bodies twist and fuse and grow into monstrous shapes, limbs bending in directions limbs are not supposed to bend, skins stretching over new growths that were never part of a human body before. The show calls these creatures Cronenbergs, a nod to a filmmaker known for body horror, and the name has stuck with fans ever since. Within a day, the entire population of Earth has been turned into something that no longer looks human at all. Rick knows exactly what caused this. He is not confused about the source of the problem. He built the device, he used the device, and he watched it spread. There is no mystery here that requires investigation. What there is instead is a scientist standing in his garage looking at the wreckage of an entire planet's population and calculating how much effort it would take to fix it properly. He does manage to create something, not a cure for the Cronenberg mutations themselves, but an antidote that stops the effects of the original love potion from progressing any further. It is enough to freeze the damage in place. It is not enough to reverse it. The people who are already monsters stay monsters. Rick has the antidote in his hand, and he looks at what it can and cannot do, and he makes a decision that defines his entire character for the rest of the series. He decides that actually fixing what he broke is too much work. This is the moment the section keeps circling back to, because it is not dramatic in the way television usually makes big decisions dramatic. There is no long speech. There is no visible moment of struggle where Rick weighs the lives of billions of people against his own convenience, and we watch him agonize over the choice. He just decides it is easier to leave. The show does not slow down to underline how enormous this is. It treats the abandonment of an entire species as a mildly annoying chore Rick would rather not deal with, the same tone a person might use about not wanting to do the dishes. So Rick and Morty leave. Using the portal gun, they travel to a different dimension, one that is almost identical to their own. Same house, same street, same family members, same version of Earth that has not been destroyed. In this dimension, a different Rick and a different Morty have just died. They were working together on a machine called an ionic defibrillator, and it malfunctioned and killed them both instantly. Rick and Morty from the ruined Cronenberg dimension arrive just after this happens. They look at the bodies of their nearly identical selves, two people who share their faces, their memories up until a certain point, their entire lives up until a machine exploded, and they make another decision that the show treats with the same eerie calm as the first one. They bury the bodies in the backyard. Then they simply move into the house and become the new versions of the Rick and Morty who used to live there. Nobody in this new dimension's family notices the difference. Beth does not know her father is now a version of Rick from a planet full of monsters. Jerry does not know his son is now a version of Morty who watched an entire species mutate because of a love potion gone wrong. The replacement is seamless because Rick makes sure it is seamless. He is careful enough, competent enough, cold enough to slide into a dead man's life without leaving a mark. The surface event here is simple. A mistake happened, the mistake could not be easily fixed, so Rick found a version of reality where the mistake had not happened yet, and swapped places with the people already living it. But everything about how this is filmed and paced tells you Rick has done something like this before. He does not hesitate the way a person does the first time they do something morally enormous. He does not check with Morty about whether this is acceptable. He simply acts, the way a person acts when a decision has become procedure rather than crisis. The animation choices back this up. Rick's face during the burial scene is not twisted with guilt the way you would expect from someone burying a body that looks exactly like his own grandson. His expression is closer to mild boredom, maybe a touch of irritation that this whole situation is taking up his time. Compare that to how Morty reacts in the same scene. Visibly shaken, unable to fully process what they are doing, and the gap between the two of them becomes the entire point of the scene. Morty has just learned something about his grandfather that most children never learn about the adults raising them. This is a person who can bury a version of your own body and then eat breakfast the next morning like nothing happened. The timing of the joke placement matters too. Right after this heavy, almost silent burial sequence, the show cuts to something lighter, something absurd, breaking the tension the way it usually does. This tonal whiplash is not an accident. Comedy after horror is one of the show's signature moves, and it works here specifically because it mirrors what Rick himself is doing internally. He does not sit with the weight of what just happened. Neither does the show. Both move on almost immediately, and the fact that the show's structure copies Rick's own emotional avoidance is itself a kind of clue about how deep this pattern goes. Underneath the surface, this episode is not really about a love potion. It is about what happens when someone who is capable of fixing almost anything decides that fixing something is not worth his time. Rick is, by every measure the show gives us, one of the smartest beings in the entire universe. He builds interdimensional travel in his garage. He creates devices that can alter the basic chemistry of love itself. A person with that level of ability choosing not to reverse a disaster he personally caused is not a story about limitation, it is a story about priorities. Rick had the tools. He simply decided the effort was not worth spending on people who were, to him, replaceable. That word, replaceable, is the real engine of this section, because it is not only the ruined planet that gets replaced, it is the family, too. Rick does not mourn the version of Beth he left behind on the Cronenberg planet, the daughter who is now, presumably, living out her life surrounded by mutated neighbors and a mutated husband. He simply steps into an identical Beth's life instead, one dimension over, and continues being her father as if nothing about the swap should matter to anyone, including himself. If people can be substituted this easily, then nothing about any specific person is actually essential. Not their history, not their suffering, not even their death. There is always another version somewhere close enough to slide into the empty space. This is where the emotional weight of the episode becomes clear if you sit with it, even though the show itself refuses to sit with it for more than a few seconds. Somewhere in the multiverse, there is a planet full of people who used to be human, who are now stuck as monsters forever, whose lives were permanently and irreversibly ruined because a man wanted his grandson to get a date with a girl from school. Rick knows this. He is aware of it. He chooses not to think about it. The same way a person chooses not to think about a mistake at work once they have quietly fixed the paperwork and moved to a different desk. For the audience watching at home, especially anyone watching as a kid or a teenager first discovering the show, this episode teaches something that the show never says directly. It teaches that a person can be brilliant, likable, even funny, and still be capable of walking away from wreckage they personally created without looking back. Most shows would build an entire arc around a character learning to face the consequences of something this big. Rick Potion number 9 does not build that arc. It builds the opposite. It shows a character who is extremely good at avoiding consequences altogether by finding a fresh version of reality to step into. What makes this land so hard, even now, years after the episode first aired, is how ordinary the whole thing looks on screen. There are no dramatic music cues swelling under the burial scene. There is no moment where the camera lingers on Morty's horrified face for an uncomfortably long time to make sure you understand how messed up this is. The show trusts you to notice on your own, and if you are not paying close attention, it is entirely possible to watch this episode as a fun, weird, funny hour of television and completely miss that you just watched a man erase an entire planet of people from his life because reversing his mistake felt inconvenient. This pattern does not stay contained to one episode either. Throughout the rest of the show, Rick keeps finding version after version of situations he can leave rather than fix. New Mortys, new Beths, new planets, new timelines. Once you have watched this episode carefully, you start to notice how many times the show quietly repeats the same basic idea in smaller ways. Rick treats reality itself as something with unlimited backup copies. If one copy breaks, another one is always close enough to grab. There is a version of this idea that some fans and writers describe using very technical language, calling it existential detachment or nihilistic reductionism. But none of that language is actually necessary to understand what is happening. A much simpler way to say it is this: Rick does not believe any single version of anything, including people, including families, including entire planets, is truly one of a kind. If nothing is truly one of a kind, then nothing can really be lost forever. And if nothing can really be lost forever, then nothing Rick does actually needs to be taken that seriously, not even by Rick himself. That is the seed being planted in the very first real showcase of who Rick is underneath the jokes and the burping and the catchphrases. He is not simply a mad scientist figure doing wild experiments for laughs. He is someone whose access to endless alternate versions of reality has convinced him that almost nothing carries permanent weight. A ruined planet is not a tragedy to him. It is an inconvenience with a workaround. The most unsettling part of all of this is how competent Rick is while doing it. He is not clumsy or panicked while covering up the aftermath. He is calm, efficient, and precise. The same way he is calm and precise while building the portal gun, or curing diseases, or outsmarting galactic governments. His ability to walk away from disaster without flinching is not separate from his genius. It comes from the exact same place. The same brain that can build a machine to manipulate love is the brain that can decide, without much internal struggle, that an entire species of former humans is simply not worth saving anymore. None of this is presented by the show as something Rick feels good about, exactly. There's no moment where he grins about it or brags about outsmarting the situation. He does not treat it as a victory. He treats it as closed business. That distinction matters. A villain enjoys causing harm. Rick does not appear to enjoy any of this. He appears almost tired by it, the way a person gets tired of solving the same category of problem over and over. That tiredness is arguably more disturbing than outright cruelty would be, because it suggests this is not a one-time lapse in judgment. It suggests this is simply how Rick has learned to survive being who he is. By the end of the episode, the swap is complete. The ruined dimension is gone from the story, left behind the way you leave a bad neighborhood behind when you move to a new house. The new dimension's family goes about their lives with no idea that their father and their brother are technically not the same people who used to occupy those roles. Life resumes. Jokes continue. The show moves forward into its next adventure as if none of this happened, mirroring exactly what Rick himself has done inside the story. This is the first real crack the show shows us, the first true look underneath everything that makes Rick so entertaining to watch. Before this episode, he is mostly a funny, chaotic grandfather figure, dragging his grandson into strange situations. After this episode, if you are paying attention, you know something different about him. You know he is capable of letting an entire world die rather than doing the harder work of saving it. You know he can bury bodies that share his family's faces and feel almost nothing while doing it. You know that when Rick is given a choice between fixing what is broken and simply leaving it behind for a fresh copy, he will choose leaving almost every single time. What makes this the correct place to begin any real examination of Rick's nihilism is that it establishes the mechanism behind everything else that follows. This is not a character who simply talks about meaninglessness in cool-sounding lines while still behaving like everything actually matters to him underneath. This is a character whose very first major action in the series proves that his stated worldview and his actual behavior line up perfectly. He does not just say that nothing is truly permanent, he proves it in the most literal way possible by treating an entire planet and an entire family as fully replaceable the moment they become inconvenient. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And that raises a much bigger question than one ruined planet can answer on its own. If a person is capable of doing this once, calmly, efficiently, without much visible guilt, what does that say about every choice he ever makes involving anyone else again? If Beth can be swapped for another Beth this easily, if Morty can literally be replaced by an almost identical Morty without missing a beat, then what is actually stopping Rick from doing this again, somewhere down the line, to people the audience has grown to care about even more deeply? The show does not answer that question yet. It simply plants it, quietly, in the middle of an episode most people remember as the one with the monsters, and waits to bring it back around later, in ways that hit even harder once you already know exactly what Rick is capable of. Section 2. Infinite Dimensions, Zero Weight. What the portal gun actually does to meaning. Rick Sanchez invented a device that can open a doorway into any other version of reality. It appears in the very first episode of the series, series when Rick wakes Morty up in the middle of the night and pulls him through a green, swirling doorway into a completely different world. From that moment forward, this device, called a portal gun, becomes the single most important object in the entire show. It is also the reason almost everything else about Rick's personality makes sense. The portal gun does not simply let Rick and Morty travel to other planets. Regular travel already exists in the show through spaceships. What the portal gun does is something different. It opens a direct doorway into other versions of the same universe, places where slightly different choices were made, where different events happened, where different versions of the same people are living out different lives. Somewhere out there is a version of Earth where dinosaurs never went extinct. Somewhere else is a version where a giant creature made of garbage runs the government. Somewhere else, almost identical to the version the show follows, a different Rick and a different Morty live in a house that looks exactly the same. This idea is confirmed directly by the show itself, not just implied by fans. The concept of the multiverse, meaning an unlimited number of separate but connected realities, is treated as basic fact within the story from the earliest episodes onward. Characters reference other dimensions constantly. Other versions of Earth show up throughout the series. Other versions of Rick and Morty are shown living lives that overlap with, but are not identical to, the lives of the main characters the audience follows. By the third season, the show gives this idea an official name inside its own story. In the premiere episode of Season 3, called the Rick Shank Redemption, viewers are introduced to something called the Citadel of Ricks. This is a massive city built entirely by and for alternate versions of Rick Sanchez, gathered from across countless different dimensions. Thousands of Ricks live inside this city, all of them geniuses, all of them capable of extraordinary science, all of them essentially the same person, shaped slightly differently by different life events. The existence of the Citadel by itself confirms something enormous about Rick's place in the universe. He often refers to himself as the smartest being in existence. The Citadel proves this claim only works if you ignore the fact that an entire city is filled with other versions of him making the exact same claim about themselves. Every single Rick living there considers himself the smartest man alive, because in a strict sense, they are all equally smart. They started as the same person. Different choices, different tragedies, different paths through life turned them into slightly different individuals, but the underlying intelligence, the underlying personality traits, the underlying capacity for both brilliance and coldness all come from the same source. The show goes even further than simply showing a city full of Ricks. It reveals that the Ricks living inside the narrow range of dimensions the main story follows are all part of something called the central finite curve. This is described within the show as a specific, limited set of realities where Rick Sanchez, out of every possible version of himself across all of existence, happens to be the most intelligent version. Later episodes reveal that this arrangement did not happen naturally. It was built on purpose. Rick engineered it. He wanted to exist inside a slice of the multiverse where his own genius could not be challenged, so he manipulated the flow of certain events across countless dimensions to guarantee it. This detail matters because it shows Rick is not simply someone who happens to live inside an infinite multiverse. He actively shaped a portion of that multiverse to protect his own sense of importance. A person who genuinely believed nothing mattered would have no reason to go through this level of effort to remain uniquely brilliant. Yet Rick did exactly that, engineering an entire section of reality just to make sure no other version of himself could outshine him within it. At the same time, the Citadel of Ricks reveals something uncomfortable sitting underneath Rick's superiority. If thousands of versions of him exist, capable of the same level of genius, then whatever makes Rick special is not really coming from some rare, one-of-a-kind spark inside him personally. It is simply a trait that shows up reliably whenever a version of this exact person exists. His intelligence is common among his own duplicates. What actually separates the main Rick that the show follows from every other Rick living inside the Citadel is not his mind. It is the specific string of events, deaths, and choices that shaped him differently from the others. This becomes especially clear once the show reveals the full origin story behind Rick's family situation. The Rick Shank Redemption episode presents a memory in which Rick's wife Diane and his young daughter Beth were killed by another version of Rick after he refused an offer to join a group of interdimensional travelers. At the time this memory is shown, Rick claims it is fake, something he built to trick an interrogator during questioning by the Galactic Federation. For years, the show leaves this question open. Fans debated whether the tragedy actually happened or whether it really was a fabricated story built for a completely different purpose. The show eventually answers this question directly. In the 5th season, an episode called Rick Murray Jack shows Morty viewing an actual scan of Rick's brain, revealing real memories rather than fabricated ones. These memories confirm that Diane and Beth truly were killed, and that the loss truly did happen the way the earlier fabricated version had described, aside from a few smaller details. The tragedy was real, only the framing of it as a trick played on an interrogator had been added later. This changes how the entire multiverse structure connects back to Rick's personality. After losing his wife and daughter, Rick built the portal gun specifically to hunt down the version of himself responsible for the murders. Over what the show suggests is a very long stretch of time, he traveled from dimension to dimension, killing large numbers of alternate Ricks along the way, searching for the exact one who had murdered his family. This search is confirmed as canon through flashback material and dialogue in later seasons, particularly around the reveal of Rick Prime, the specific alternate Rick eventually identified as the true killer. During this search, Rick was moving through an unlimited number of nearly identical versions of everything he had lost. Other Beths, other Dianes, other houses that looked like his own house. Each dimension offered him a copy of the exact life that had been taken from him, just slightly different in small ways. The show confirms, through an episode called Solar Ricks in Season 5, that Rick eventually settled into one specific dimension where a different Beth had grown up without her father, since that dimension's Rick had abandoned the family instead of dying. Rick moved into the empty space left behind by that other Rick, and that is the version of Beth, and by extension the version of Morty, the entire series has followed from the beginning. This means the family the audience has been watching since the very first episode is not, strictly speaking, Rick's original family at all. It is a replacement family, found inside one specific slice of an infinite set of similar families, chosen because it happened to have an opening where Rick could fit himself back in. The show does not hide this fact once it reveals it. It states it plainly, through Rick's own memories and through direct confirmation in Solar Ricks, that this is the Beth whose father abandoned her, not the Beth whose father was murdered alongside her mother. Once this piece of information is confirmed as canon, an entire way of watching the show opens up. Every time Rick calls Beth his daughter, every time he protects Summer and Morty, every time he seems to genuinely care about his family, all of that affection is being directed at people who are, in the most literal sense, substitutes for people he actually lost. This is not a metaphor added by outside interpretation. It is a direct plot point confirmed by the show itself across multiple seasons. Given this, the earlier idea from Rick Potion number 9 becomes easier to understand. Swapping into a nearly identical family after the Cronenberg disaster was not the first time Rick did something like this. It was, according to the show's own confirmed backstory, a repeat of exactly what he had already done once before, on a much larger and more painful scale, after losing Diane and his original Beth. Rick's willingness to step into an almost identical replacement family is not a strange one-time reaction to an unusual crisis. It is a pattern he had already lived through personally, and one the multiverse makes possible for him again and again. This is where the portal gun's true effect on Rick becomes visible. It does not simply give him transportation, it gives him unlimited emotional backup copies of the exact life he lost. Whenever something becomes unbearable, whenever a version of his life gets destroyed or taken from him, the portal gun ensures another nearly identical version is always just one doorway away. Grief, in a normal human life, has to be processed because there is no alternative version of the lost person to replace them with. For Rick, that basic rule of loss simply does not apply. The tools he built for himself remove the requirement to sit with any specific loss for very long, because another close enough version is always reachable. The Citadel of Ricks makes this same idea visible on a larger scale, beyond just Rick's personal family situation. The Citadel operates almost like its own small country, with laws, currency, government offices, and even a police force made up of alternate Ricks keeping order over other alternate Ricks. Episodes set inside the Citadel show Ricks working ordinary jobs, living in apartments, going about daily life exactly like any other city's population, except every single resident is a version of the exact same man. When one Rick dies inside the Citadel, life continues completely unaffected, because so many nearly identical Ricks remain that the loss barely registers as significant to anyone still living there. This detail exposes something important about how meaning works differently for Rick compared to how it works for people who do not have access to a multiverse. For most people, a life event carries weight partly because it cannot be undone or replaced. A specific person's death matters because there is no other identical version of them waiting somewhere else. A specific mistake matters because there is no reset button available to erase it and try again with a fresh copy of the same situation. Rick's world does not follow these same limits. Nearly everything he could lose has a close backup somewhere else in the multiverse, and the tools sitting in his own garage are capable of reaching that backup whenever needed. This explains why Rick so often behaves as though nothing carries lasting consequences, without that behavior making him a simple cartoon villain. He is not pretending nothing matters as some kind of performance. Given the tools available to him, and the specific history the show has confirmed he lived through, very little actually does carry the kind of permanent weight it would carry for someone without access to infinite alternate versions of everything. Losing a specific Beth is recoverable, because another Beth exists close enough to slide into her place. Losing a specific Earth is recoverable, because another Earth exists close enough to move into instead. Even losing a specific Rick, somewhere out there among the thousands living inside the Citadel, barely disrupts anything, because so many others exist to fill in around the gap. The unsettling part is that Rick himself understands all of this completely. This is not a blind spot in his thinking. He is the one who built the portal gun. He is the one who engineered the central finite curve to protect his own uniqueness within a narrow slice of the wider multiverse. He is the one who chose, deliberately, to settle into a replacement family rather than continue searching for a version of Diane who might still be alive somewhere. Every part of this system runs exactly the way Rick designed it to run, which means his detachment from loss is not an accident of his circumstances. It is closer to a structure he built for himself on purpose, whether or not he ever consciously framed it to himself that way. None of this erases the grief that clearly still exists underneath everything. The show confirms, through the time loop revealed in Solarix, that Rick kept his original home dimension frozen at the exact moment he lost Diane and Beth for what is implied to be decades, unable to fully let go of that specific loss, even while living an entirely different life elsewhere. This detail complicates the picture in an important way, and it becomes the direct subject of a much later section in this exact examination. For now, what matters is simpler. The portal gun gave Rick access to infinite versions of everything he could lose, and rather than teaching him that loss does not matter, it appears to have taught him that loss can always be quietly replaced instead of properly faced. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This exact idea, treating people as close enough to interchangeable that losing one version does not require real processing, shows up again in a much smaller, much more direct way inside the Sanchez household itself. In an episode from Season 2, Rick sits his own grandchildren down and tells them plainly, using a whiteboard to make his point, exactly how replaceable he considers them to be compared to each other. That scene is where this examination goes next. Section 3. You're both pieces of shit. The whiteboard scene. Season 2 of the show opens with an episode called A Rickle in Time. The episode begins right after the ending of the previous season, with Rick, Morty, and Summer frozen in place at the front door of the house. Rick had frozen time itself to stop and think through a problem, and the freeze accidentally splits reality into 3 separate timelines running side by side. In each of these 3 timelines, Rick, Morty, and Summer exist completely alone, cut off from each other, and from the rest of the world, unable to move forward until Rick can figure out how to safely restart time again. Being alone inside a frozen timeline for an extended period changes each of them in different ways. Morty, left completely by himself with nothing to do and no one to talk to, eventually breaks down from the isolation. He starts talking to himself, inventing a fake friend to keep himself company, and by the time the timelines are set to merge back together, he has spent what feels like 6 full months trapped in total silence. Summer, in her own separate frozen timeline, goes through a similar experience of extended isolation, though she handles the boredom and loneliness somewhat differently than Morty does. Rick eventually solves the problem and merges the 3 timelines back into one. Once time resumes, the 3 of them are together again. But there is a serious risk hanging over what happens next. Because they were each alone in their own separate timeline for a long stretch of time, each of them experienced a different version of the same period. If Jerry and Beth ever find out that time was frozen at all, or if the 3 of them tell contradicting stories about that period to each other or to the rest of the family, the instability caused by 3 overlapping timelines could become dangerous. This means Rick, Morty, and Summer need to get their stories straight before facing the rest of the family. They need to agree on one single, consistent version of events from the past 6 months so that nothing about the frozen timelines gets exposed. This should be a simple task. All 3 of them know the actual truth. All 3 of them have a shared interest in keeping the secret. Getting the story straight should take a few minutes at most. Instead, Morty and Summer start arguing almost immediately. Each of them experience their own separate version of those 6 frozen months, alone, with no contact with each other, and their memories of small details do not line line up. What one of them remembers as happening a certain way, the other remembers differently. The disagreement starts small, over minor details, but it grows quickly into a real fight between the two of them, each one insisting their version of events is the correct one and refusing to back down. Rick is standing right there while this argument builds, and he needs it to stop immediately, because every second they spend arguing is a second they are not agreeing on a cover story before Jerry and Beth show up asking questions. Rather than trying to gently mediate between his two grandchildren or calmly walk them through resolving their disagreement, Rick picks a completely different approach. He tells them to sit down. Morty sits in one spot, Summer sits in another.
Rick tells them directly that despite their obvious differences from each other, and despite whatever specific complaints they have about each other's memory of events, there is one thing they actually have in common that matters more than any of it. As far as Rick is concerned, both of them are pieces of shit. He does not stop there. Rick tells them he can prove this claim mathematically. He then produces a whiteboard right there in the middle of the argument and begins working through calculations meant to demonstrate using actual math that his grandchildren are equally disappointing to him. He treats this the same way he would treat solving any other kind of scientific problem, breaking down a personal insult into something resembling a formal proof, complete with a diagram, as if the emotional damage of the statement needs supporting evidence to be taken seriously. The scene plays this entirely for comedy, and it works as comedy specifically because of how seriously Rick takes the exercise. He does not deliver the insult in a moment of anger, shouting something cruel and immediately regretting it the way a person might in the heat of an argument. He is calm the entire time. He treats the math as the actual point of the conversation, more important than resolving the disagreement between Morty and Summer, more important than actually working out what the group's cover story is going to be. What makes this moment land the way it does is the effect it has on Morty and Summer. The two of them stop arguing with each other almost immediately once Rick delivers this line. Their disagreement, which had been building into a real fight only seconds earlier, dissolves the instant they are both insulted equally by the same person. Instead of continuing to argue about whose memory of the frozen timeline was correct, they are now united by having just been told, with supporting math, that neither of them is worth more to their grandfather than the other. This is a small detail, but it says something important about how Rick handles conflict inside his own family. Rather than solving a disagreement by actually addressing what the disagreement is about, he ends it by giving both sides a bigger, shared problem to be upset about instead. Morty and Summer stop fighting each other because Rick has just reminded them both, at the same time, that he sees them as interchangeable and unimportant compared to himself. The specific content of their argument, whose memory was accurate, never actually gets resolved. It simply stops mattering once a bigger insult replaces it. The whiteboard itself is worth paying attention to as well. Rick does not simply say the insult and move on. He treats it as something that requires visual proof, the same way he might explain a scientific concept to Morty during one of their actual adventures. This tells you something about how Rick's mind works even when the subject has nothing to do with science at all. Personal relationships, family dynamics, even a direct insult toward his own grandchildren, all get filtered through the same instinct to reduce complicated human situations down to something that can be diagrammed, calculated, and proven on a board. None of this seems to bother Rick in the way it clearly affects Morty and Summer in the moment. He does not appear to consider whether telling two children they are both pieces of garbage compared to him might cause any lasting harm. He treats the entire exchange as a practical solution to a practical problem, which, from a purely functional standpoint, it actually is. The argument stops. The group is able to move forward and agree on a cover story before Jerry and Beth find out what really happened during those 6 frozen months. Rick's method works exactly the way he intended it to work. What this scene reveals about Rick goes beyond simple bluntness or a lack of tact. Plenty of characters on television are shown being rude or harsh toward the people around them without it meaning much beyond a joke. This scene is different because of how specifically Rick frames the insult. He does not simply tell Morty and Summer they are both annoying him, or that he does not have time for their argument. He frames it as a mathematical fact about their equal lack of value to him personally, something provable, something that applies to both of them exactly the same amount, regardless of anything that makes them different as individuals. Morty and Summer are, in reality, very different people. The show spends plenty of time throughout its run establishing distinct personalities for each of them. Morty tends to be more anxious, more easily overwhelmed, but also capable of surprising moral clarity in certain situations. Summer tends to be more socially focused, more concerned with her image among her peers, but also shown at various points throughout the series being just as brave and capable as Morty during dangerous situations. They are not interchangeable characters within the show's own storytelling. Yet in this specific scene, Rick collapses all of that individual personality down into a
single shared category: both pieces of shit, treated as mathematically equal, regardless of anything that actually separates them as people. This connects directly back to the pattern already established in the first two sections of this examination. In Rick Potion number 9, an entire planet and an entire family were treated as replaceable the moment fixing them became inconvenient.
In the broader multiverse structure revealed later in the show, entire dimensions worth of Ricks, Beths, and Mortys exist as close enough duplicates of each other that losing one specific version rarely causes lasting disruption. Here, on a much smaller and more personal scale, the same basic instinct shows up again. Rick reduces his own grandchildren to statistically equal, largely interchangeable disappointments, using actual math to make the point, rather than engaging with either of them as distinct individuals worth understanding on their own terms. The comedic tone of the scene does a lot of work to soften how harsh this actually is. Audiences watching the episode are meant to laugh at the absurdity of Rick pulling out a whiteboard in the middle of a family argument, treating an insult like a scientific presentation. The joke works. It is genuinely one of the more memorable small moments from the second season. But underneath the joke sits a character who consistently treats deeply personal situations, family conflict included, using the exact same detached, analytical approach he uses when solving problems involving interdimensional travel or dangerous alien technology. There is no separate emotional mode Rick switches into when the subject is his own grandchildren rather than a science experiment. The math comes out either way. This detail becomes more meaningful once you consider how the episode resolves. After Rick delivers this line and produces the whiteboard, the three of them do eventually get their story straight and successfully avoid exposing the frozen timeline secret to the rest of the family. From a pure results standpoint, Rick's approach worked. The problem that actually mattered to him, keeping Jerry and Beth from finding out what happened, was solved. The emotional impact this had on Morty and Summer individually was never addressed again within the episode itself. The show does not return to this moment later to check in on how Morty or Summer felt about being told, with supporting math, that they mean the same, low amount to their grandfather. This lack of follow-up is consistent with how the show generally treats Rick's harsher moments throughout its run. Rather than building toward an episode where Morty or Summer directly confronts Rick about a specific insult like this one, the show tends to let these moments exist as one-off character beats, memorable in isolation, but rarely referenced again directly. This does not mean the moment has no lasting effect on how audiences understand Rick's character. It simply means the show trusts these small, specific scenes to speak for themselves, rather than building entire arcs around processing them. What the whiteboard scene ultimately demonstrates is a very specific version of Rick's detachment, different from the detachment shown in the first two sections. Rick Potion number 9 showed detachment expressed through action, walking away from a ruined planet rather than fixing it. The multiverse structure showed detachment built into the actual architecture of Rick's world, an unlimited supply of near-identical replacements for nearly everything he could lose. This scene shows detachment expressed directly, out loud, toward two specific people sitting right in front of him, stated as a fact he considers provable, rather than a private thought he keeps to himself. Saying something out loud to another person carries a different weight than simply acting on a belief privately. Rick does not merely treat his grandchildren as replaceable through his actions, the way he treated an entire planet as replaceable in the first section. He tells them directly, using specific words, that he sees very little difference in value between the two of them, and he backs the statement up with math to make sure the point lands as clearly as possible. This is Rick's private worldview being spoken aloud, directed specifically at two children who have no context for understanding why their grandfather would frame an insult this way. The whiteboard scene fits into a larger picture the show has been building across every scene examined so far. First, an entire planet gets abandoned because fixing it takes too much effort. Then, the tools and structures Rick has built for himself reveal a personal history built on replacing lost loved ones with close enough substitutes found elsewhere in the multiverse. Now, that same instinct toward replacement and equivalence gets spoken directly to two specific grandchildren, framed as a provable fact rather than an emotional outburst. Each of these moments, taken individually, could be dismissed as one strange episode, one unusual reveal, one harsh joke. Taken together, they start forming something closer to a consistent pattern running underneath Rick's character from the very earliest seasons of the show. He does not treat people, places, or even entire planets as permanently important the way most people are taught to treat these things. Whether through action, through the structure of the universe he has built around himself, or through direct words spoken to his own family, the same basic idea keeps surfacing again and again. There is one more layer to this scene worth noting before moving forward. Despite everything just described, Rick's insult in this scene is also, in its own strange way, a moment of connection
connection between Morty and Summer. By insulting them equally, he accidentally gives them a shared experience to bond over instead of continuing to fight each other. This detail complicates a simple reading of the scene as pure cruelty.
Rick's bluntness, whether intentional or not, ends up pulling his two grandchildren back onto the same side after they had been arguing moments earlier. Whether this outcome was something Rick anticipated or simply a lucky side effect of an insult meant only to end an argument quickly, the show does not say directly. This small piece of ambiguity becomes important later, once the show moves into episodes that examine Rick's actual feelings underneath all of this bluntness more directly. For now, the whiteboard scene stands as clear, direct evidence that Rick's detachment is not something the audience has to infer from his actions alone. He states it outright, treats it as a fact worth proving, and moves on without appearing to consider whether saying it caused any real damage to the two grandchildren sitting in front of him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section moves from Rick's treatment of his own family into how he describes one of the most basic human experiences there is. In an episode from the same first season that introduced the Cronenberg disaster, Rick sits Morty down and explains exactly what he believes love actually is, using the same cold, scientific framing he applies to almost everything else in his life. Section 4. Love as Chemistry, the Rick Potion. Number 9. Monologue. The same episode that showed Rick abandoning a ruined planet also contains one of the clearest statements Rick ever makes about what he actually believes love is. This happens earlier in Rick Potion number 9, before the love potion spreads out of control, while Rick is still trying to help Morty with his crush on a classmate named Jessica. Morty wants Jessica to notice him before an upcoming school dance. He does not ask Rick for advice about talking to her or building up the courage to approach her normally. He asks Rick for something faster, something guaranteed to work without any of the usual risk of rejection. Rick, instead of pointing out that this is a strange request or suggesting Morty simply try talking to her like a normal teenager would, treats the request as a solvable science problem. He builds a device capable of directly changing the chemical signals in a person's brain related to attraction. Before using the device, Rick explains to Morty exactly what he believes is actually happening whenever two people fall in love. He tells Morty plainly that what people call love is nothing more than a chemical reaction that pushes animals toward breeding. According to Rick, this reaction feels intense and overwhelming at first, then slowly fades over time, eventually leaving people stuck in relationships and marriages that no longer feel the way they did at the start. He tells Morty this happened to him personally, and he tells Morty it is already going to happen to his parents, Beth and Jerry, whether Morty realizes it or not. Rick does not frame any of this as sad or unfortunate. He presents it as simple biological fact, the same tone he might use explaining how a car engine works or how a chemical compound reacts under heat. There is no hesitation in his voice, no sign that he considers this a difficult or uncomfortable subject to bring up with his own grandson. He speaks about the collapse of romantic relationships the way a person might describe something as routine as food going bad after being left out too long. He then gives Morty direct advice based on this belief. He tells Morty to break the cycle, meaning to avoid getting trapped in the same pattern Rick and, in his prediction, Beth and Jerry are stuck in. Instead of pursuing romantic relationships that Rick believes are guaranteed to fade and disappoint, Rick tells Morty to focus on science instead, framing scientific pursuit as a more reliable and worthwhile use of his time than romantic attachment. This scene is brief within the episode, lasting only a short exchange of dialogue before the actual love potion plot moves forward. Despite its short length, it lays out one of the clearest, most direct statements of Rick's personal philosophy found anywhere in the entire show. He is not simply expressing frustration about one specific relationship that went badly for him. He is explaining what he believes love actually is at its core, stripped down to nothing more than brain chemistry designed by evolution to encourage reproduction, destined to fade no matter who the two people involved happen to be. The timing of this speech matters. Rick delivers it to Morty right before building a device specifically designed to manipulate the exact chemical reaction he has just finished describing. If love really is nothing more than a chemical signal in the brain, then manipulating that signal directly, the way Rick is about to do with his invention, is not cheating or manipulating another person in any meaningful sense. It is simply adjusting a biological process the same way a doctor might adjust a patient's blood pressure with medication. Rick's actions immediately after this speech line up exactly with what he claims to believe. He does not treat Jessica's feelings as something meaningful or sacred that should not be tampered with. He treats them as a chemical process that can be safely edited using the right tool. This connects the love speech directly to the disaster that
follows later in the same episode. Because Rick sees romantic feelings as nothing more than adjustable brain chemistry, he does not hesitate to build a device capable of spreading that adjustment far beyond its intended target. The device is not designed with any built-in limit to keep its effects contained to one single person. It ends up spreading across the entire student body, then the town, then the whole planet, transforming into the same disaster examined already in Section 1. The love speech and the resulting catastrophe are part of the same overall event inside the same episode, connected directly by Rick's underlying belief that love is simply chemistry, and therefore fair game to manipulate freely. Rick's own life, as revealed later in the show, adds another layer to this speech. By the time viewers eventually learn Rick's real backstory involving his wife Diane, confirmed as canon through later season reveals discussed earlier in this examination, it becomes clear that Rick is speaking from personal experience when he tells Morty that love fades and leaves people disappointed. Rick was married. He lost his wife under traumatic circumstances. His current bitterness about love is not simply an abstract scientific theory he came up with out of nowhere. It is shaped by an actual relationship that ended in tragedy, filtered afterward into a coldly scientific explanation that strips away any of the personal pain behind it. This does not make Rick's statement to Morty any less troubling in the moment it is delivered. Morty, at the time of this conversation, has no idea about Rick's full backstory involving Diane. As far as Morty knows, he is simply receiving advice from his grandfather about an ordinary school crush. And the advice he receives is that love is a trap built into human biology, destined to leave him disappointed no matter who he chooses to pursue it with. Morty is being taught this lesson at a young age, well before he has any real experience of his own to weigh it against. The specific target of Rick's prediction matters as well. Rick does not simply speak in general terms about love failing for people somewhere out in the world. He tells Morty directly that this exact pattern is already happening to his own parents, Beth and Jerry. This detail connects the love speech to material the show explores extensively across multiple seasons. Beth and Jerry's marriage is shown throughout the series experiencing serious strain, including periods of separation and divorce explored in later seasons. Rick's prediction to Morty in this very early episode ends up matching, at least on the surface, struggles that do eventually appear within Beth and Jerry's relationship as the show progresses. Whether Rick's prediction about Beth and Jerry came true because he was simply right about how relationships generally work, or because his own influence over the family contributed to problems within their marriage, is a question the show does not answer directly inside this specific episode. What can be stated as fact is that Rick delivered this exact prediction to Morty in the first season, well before any of the marital struggles between Beth and Jerry become a major storyline later in the series. The specific words Rick chooses during this speech are worth looking at closely. He does not describe love as complicated or difficult or simply not for everyone. He describes it using very precise clinical language, referring to it directly as a chemical reaction, something that compels behavior rather than something people freely choose. This word choice removes any sense of romance, decision, or personal meaning from the entire concept. According to Rick's framing, two people falling in love are not making a meaningful choice about each other as individuals. They are simply responding to a biological signal that would produce roughly the same outcome regardless of which two specific people happen to be involved. This lines up directly with patterns already established in earlier sections of this examination. In the very same episode, Rick treats an entire planet full of people, along with his own family, as replaceable the moment keeping them becomes inconvenient. Here, in a conversation that happens earlier in that same episode, Rick applies a similar kind of thinking to romantic relationships themselves. If love is simply chemistry, then any two specific people involved in a relationship are, at their core, somewhat interchangeable with any other two people who might experience the same chemical process together. The specific identity of Jessica, or of Beth, or of Jerry matters less in Rick's framing than the underlying biological mechanism producing the feelings in the first place. Rick's advice to Morty to break the cycle and focus on science instead carries its own significance as well. He is not simply warning Morty away from one particular bad relationship. He is advising Morty to avoid romantic pursuit altogether, treating scientific work as a safer, more reliable alternative to human connection. This piece of advice fits into a larger pattern seen throughout the show, where Rick consistently treats his scientific work as the most stable, most trustworthy part of his entire life. More reliable than family relationships, more reliable than romantic relationships, more reliable than nearly anything involving other people directly. This preference for science over personal connection shows up again in other parts of the show beyond this single episode. Rick's most consistent, longest-lasting positive relationships throughout the series tend to involve his inventions and his work rather than other people. His portal gun, his various devices, his ongoing scientific projects all remain constant fixtures across the entire run of the show, while his relationships with people, including his own family members, go through repeated periods of conflict, distance, and instability.
The advice he gives Morty in this scene, choose science over love, reflects a choice Rick appears to have made in his own life as well, whether consciously or not. None of this means Rick is shown as being completely without any capacity for connection. Later sections of this examination look closely at moments where Rick's behavior appears to directly contradict the very philosophy he lays out in this speech, including his relationship with Bird Person and his eventual reaction to losing him, along with his complicated efforts to hold on to some version of his family across the multiverse. The love speech in Rick Potion number 9 does not exist in isolation as the only piece of evidence about how Rick actually feels about connection and relationships. It exists as an early, blunt statement of a worldview that later parts of the show complicate significantly. For now, taken on its own, the speech stands as clear, direct, spoken evidence of how Rick frames one of the most basic human experiences there is. He does not treat love as meaningful or sacred. He treats it as a temporary chemical process, destined to fade, worth avoiding in favor of something he considers more stable and worthwhile. He delivers this belief directly to a 14-year-old grandson who has no context to push back against it, framing his own personal disappointment as universal, unavoidable fact rather than one specific man's bitter conclusion drawn from one specific painful history. The specific timing of this scene inside the episode reinforces how directly Rick's stated beliefs and his actual actions match up. Almost immediately after telling Morty that love is nothing more than manipulable brain chemistry, Rick builds a device to manipulate exactly that chemistry, setting off the disaster examined in the first section of this entire series. His words and his actions are not separate from each other. They are two parts of the exact same event, spoken and then immediately acted upon within the same episode. This tight connection between what Rick says about love and what he does immediately afterward makes this scene one of the clearest, most direct pieces of evidence available anywhere in the show for understanding how Rick actually views human connection. It is not a passing joke told once and never referenced again. It is a stated belief, immediately followed by an action that only makes sense if that belief is genuinely true for the character delivering it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section moves away from Rick's personal relationships and back toward one of his most quoted lines from the entire series. A statement passed down not from Rick directly, but from Morty to his sister, Summer, revealing exactly how deeply Rick's worldview has already been absorbed by the next generation of his own family. Section 5. Nobody exists on purpose. Ricksty Minutes. The 8th episode of the first season is called Ricksty Minutes. Much of the episode takes place inside the Smith family living room, where the family is using a piece of Rick's technology that lets them watch television broadcasts from an unlimited number of alternate dimensions. While Jerry, Beth, Rick, and Morty spend most of the episode flipping through strange and often funny alternate reality television shows, a separate and more serious storyline plays out at the same time between Morty and Summer. Earlier in the episode, using the same interdimensional cable technology, Summer accidentally discovers something about her own past that she was never supposed to know. She learns that she was not planned. She finds out that Beth became pregnant with her before Beth and Jerry were fully ready to have a child, and that their decision to get married and build a life together happened partly because of this unplanned pregnancy rather than purely out of choice. Summer had never known any of this before this moment in the episode. Discovering it upsets her deeply, leaving her to question whether her entire existence was some kind of accident or mistake rather than something her parents actually wanted. Summer goes outside to be alone after learning this. Morty follows her out to check on her. This is where the conversation happens that produces one of the most repeated lines from the entire series. Morty sits down next to his sister and tries to help her process what she just learned. Rather than telling her that her parents secretly wanted her all along, or trying to convince her the pregnancy was somehow planned, despite what she just found out, Morty says something very different. He tells Summer that nobody exists on purpose. He tells her that nobody truly belongs anywhere. He tells her that everybody is eventually going to die. Then, almost immediately after saying all of this, he suggests they go back inside and watch more television together. This exact sequence of statements, delivered calmly and without any dramatic buildup, has become one of the most quoted moments
moments in the entire show's history. Fans regularly bring it up as one of the clearest examples of the philosophy running underneath the series. What makes the scene worth examining closely is not simply that the line sounds bleak on its own. It is who says it and where a 14-year-old boy would have picked up this exact way of thinking in the first place.
Morty is the one delivering this speech, not Rick. By this point in the season, Morty has spent an extended amount of time traveling with Rick across the multiverse, exposed repeatedly to Rick's specific worldview, his specific way of handling disaster, and his specific way of talking about family, love, and consequences. The particular combination of ideas Morty expresses to Summer in this scene, that existence has no built-in purpose, that belonging is not guaranteed anywhere, that death is simply an unavoidable fact rather than something to be feared or dwelled on, matches closely with attitudes Rick has already demonstrated directly in earlier episodes examined in this series. Morty does not present these ideas as devastating or frightening. He says them the way a person recites something they have already accepted and moved past emotionally. There is no crack in his voice, no visible struggle to get the words out. He delivers the line the same way Rick tends to deliver his own bleakest statements throughout the show. Calmly, directly, without much visible emotional weight attached to the words themselves. Immediately after saying all of this, Morty suggests they go back inside and watch television. This detail matters just as much as the speech itself. Morty does not follow up his statement with any kind of comfort, reassurance, or plan for how Summer should feel better about what she just learned. He simply offers a distraction instead, treating television as a reasonable way to move past a piece of information as significant as questioning whether your own birth was wanted or not. Summer's reaction to hearing this is worth noting directly. She does not push back against what Morty says. She does not argue that he is wrong, or that surely existence must have some kind of built-in purpose after all. Based on how the scene plays out, she appears to accept what he tells her, and the two of them go back inside together shortly afterward, rejoining the rest of the family in front of the television as if the conversation has successfully done its job of helping her feel better. This scene reveals something specific about how nihilistic ideas move through this family. Rick never appears directly in this particular conversation between Morty and Summer. He is inside the house during this exact moment, watching interdimensional television with Jerry and Beth, completely unaware that his grandson is outside repeating a version of his own worldview to comfort his granddaughter. Yet the ideas Morty uses to help Summer process a painful realization about her own existence trace directly back to the same general philosophy Rick has demonstrated repeatedly throughout the sections already examined in this series. This is the first time this series has directly shown the impact of Rick's worldview reaching beyond Rick himself. In earlier sections, all of the evidence examined came from things Rick personally said or did. The Cronenberg abandonment, the multiverse structure Rick engineered, the whiteboard scene, the love speech. All of these directly involve Rick as the one speaking or acting. This scene is different. It shows the same underlying ideas being passed down and used by someone else entirely, without Rick needing to be present or aware that it is happening. This detail adds an important layer to understanding how deeply these ideas have taken hold within the family by this point in the show's run. Morty is not simply repeating something Rick told him directly in this specific moment. He is applying a general framework of thinking, absorbed gradually through months of traveling with Rick, to a brand new situation involving his own sister. This suggests the ideas are not confined to specific advice Rick gives in specific moments. They have become something closer to a general outlook Morty has started applying on his own, in situations where Rick is not even present to guide him. The content of what Morty actually says also deserves close attention on its own terms, separate from where the ideas originally came from. Telling someone that nobody exists on purpose is, on the surface, a statement that could easily make an already difficult moment feel worse. Yet within the context of the scene, it appears to function as comfort rather than further pain. The logic behind why it works this way is straightforward once you look closely at it. If nobody exists on purpose, in the sense that no one's existence follows some grand, carefully designed plan, then Summer being an accident is no different from anyone else's existence in the universe. Her situation is not uniquely sad or uniquely unwanted. It is simply the same basic randomness that applies to everyone, including Morty himself. This reframing removes the sting from Summer's specific situation by making it universal rather than personal. She is not uniquely unwanted. According to Morty's framing, nobody is specifically wanted or unwanted by the universe in any deep built-in sense. Existence itself, for everyone, comes from a combination of biological chance and circumstance, rather than some deeper cosmic plan. Summer being an unplanned pregnancy fits into this same basic pattern, rather than standing apart from it as something uniquely tragic. The second part of Morty's statement, that nobody truly
belongs anywhere extends this same logic further. If nobody has a built-in, guaranteed place they are supposed to occupy in the world, then Summer not fitting perfectly into the family story she thought she knew does not mean she is somehow broken or out of place. Not belonging anywhere, in some deep, permanent sense, becomes, in Morty's framing, simply the normal condition everyone shares, rather than a problem unique to her. The final part of the statement, that everybody is going to die, might seem like the bleakest addition of the three, yet it fits the same overall pattern. If death eventually comes for everyone, regardless of how they were conceived, how wanted they were at birth, or how their life unfolds, then Summer's specific origin story becomes less significant when measured against the larger, shared fact that awaits every single person exactly the same way. Being unplanned matters less when compared against the fact that everyone, planned or not, wanted or not, eventually reaches the same ending. This entire framework, stripped down to its basic pieces, functions as a kind of emotional leveling tool. Rather than solving Summer's specific pain directly, it places her pain into a much larger category that applies equally to everyone else, making her particular situation feel less isolating. This exact strategy, taking something painful and specific and reframing it as universal and unavoidable, mirrors strategies Rick has already used throughout earlier sections examined in this series, particularly the whiteboard scene, where a specific argument between Morty and Summer got resolved not by addressing the actual disagreement, but by giving both of them a bigger, shared problem to focus on instead. The final piece of the scene, Morty suggesting they go back inside to watch television, reinforces this same basic pattern one more time. Rather than sitting with the difficult feelings that come from learning something this personal, the solution offered is distraction. Television, in this specific moment, functions the same way Rick's scientific work functions throughout the rest of the show, as a reliable activity to redirect attention away from something emotionally difficult rather than a space where that difficulty gets directly worked through. Summer accepting this offer, and the two of them returning inside together, suggests the strategy works, at least in the short term shown within this specific episode. The show does not return to this exact moment later to check whether Summer continued processing what she learned about her own conception, or whether the comfort Morty offered that night actually resolved anything long term. Similar to patterns already noted in earlier sections, particularly the aftermath of the whiteboard scene, the show tends to let these individual moments stand on their own, rather than building direct follow-up storylines around them. What makes this scene especially significant within this examination is what it reveals about how far Rick's influence extends without him needing to be directly involved. Every piece of evidence examined in the first 4 sections came from something Rick personally did or said. This scene shows the same underlying pattern of thought operating independently in someone else entirely. Someone still young, still early in his own life, already equipped with a framework for handling painful information that treats specific personal pain as something best diluted into universal, unavoidable facts, rather than confronted directly. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This raises a clear question heading into the next section of this examination. If these ideas have already spread this far within just one season, shaping how a 14-year-old comforts his own sister, what happens when the source of these ideas, Rick himself, is forced into a situation where distraction and reframing are not available as options? The next section moves into an episode from Season 4, where Rick, rather than distracting from a difficult subject, is forced directly into a room built specifically to make him face himself with no ability to leave. Section 6, The Citadel of Ricks. Even Rick isn't special. The Citadel of Ricks first appears fully in the Season 3 premiere, an episode called The Rickshank Rickdemption. Before this episode, the show had already hinted that other versions of Rick existed somewhere in the wider multiverse. This episode is where the show confirms exactly how many of them there are, how they organized themselves, and how far Rick himself was willing to go to make sure none of them stood in his way. The show reveals, through flashback material and later dialogue, that after the deaths of his wife Diane and his daughter Beth in his original dimension, confirmed as real events by later seasons rather than a fabricated story, Rick built his own portal gun specifically to search the multiverse for the exact version of himself responsible for killing them. This search led him across countless dimensions, encountering version after version of himself along the way. According to information given directly in the show, Rick killed a large number of these alternate Ricks during this search, unable to tell immediately which one, if any, was the one he was actually looking for. This search eventually caused a reaction from the wider population of Ricks scattered across the multiverse. A group of several thousand alternate Ricks, each one aware that Rick C-137 137 was moving through dimensions killing versions of himself without hesitation, decided to band together for protection.
This group organized itself into what became the Citadel of Rix, a shared home base built specifically as a defense against threats like Rix C-137 and other dangers found throughout the wider universe, including the Galactic Federation. Eventually, this group and Rix C-137 reached an agreement. Rather than continuing an endless war between one extremely dangerous Rick and thousands of others banding together against him, a peace was worked out. As part of this agreement, Rick actually helped design and build the physical structure of the Citadel itself. The show states this directly. The same man who had spent an unknown length of time killing large numbers of his own alternate selves ended up contributing his own expertise to construct the very safe haven built specifically to protect the rest of them from him. This detail alone says something important. Rick was capable of shifting, without much visible internal conflict, from actively hunting and killing other versions of himself to helping build their shared home. There is no indication in the show that Rick felt lasting guilt over the Ricks he had already killed during his search. The agreement appears to function purely as a practical solution, ending a conflict that had become inconvenient for both sides, rather than a moment of genuine remorse changing how Rick views the other Ricks going forward. The Citadel grew from this starting point into something far larger than a simple safe house. By the time the show returns to it directly in the third season, it has become a fully functioning city, home to thousands of Ricks and Mortys pulled from countless different dimensions across the multiverse. It has its own government, run by a group called the Council of Ricks. It has its own economy, its own housing, its own daily routines for the Ricks and Mortys living inside it. Many of these Ricks work ordinary jobs within the Citadel, rather than living the kind of high-stakes, adventure-filled life the show's main Rick experiences constantly. This detail matters directly to the larger argument running through this entire series. If thousands of Ricks exist, all sharing the same basic starting intelligence, many of them living quiet, unremarkable lives inside a city built specifically to house people exactly like them, then Rick's constant insistence that he is uniquely brilliant becomes much harder to fully believe. The Citadel does not simply suggest that other smart people exist somewhere in the universe. It confirms, directly within the show's own canon, that thousands of versions of the exact same person exist, sharing the same base intelligence, the same scientific ability, the same general personality traits, shaped only slightly differently by different specific life events. What Rick does with this information once he is captured by the Galactic Federation reveals even more about how he actually views these other versions of himself. After being taken into Federation custody at the end of Season 2, Rick is held in a maximum security prison specifically designed to hold extremely dangerous prisoners. Rather than simply trying to escape on his own, Rick sets a much larger plan into motion, one that requires sacrificing an enormous number of other Ricks in order to succeed. Rick's escape plan involves teleporting the entire Citadel of Ricks directly into the same physical space as the Galactic Federation prison holding him. This is confirmed directly by the show as an intentional choice, not an accident or unintended side effect of some other action. Rick chooses this specific method because it creates chaos on a scale large enough to cover his actual goal, which is gaining access to the Federation's most secure systems while everyone else is distracted by the resulting disaster. The collision between the Citadel and the Federation prison causes both structures to partially collapse. Large numbers of Ricks and Mortys living inside the Citadel are killed in the resulting chaos, including the entire Council of Ricks, the elected leadership governing the Citadel at the time. The show does not soften this outcome or present it as an unfortunate accident Rick regrets afterward. It is shown as a direct, intended result of a plan Rick built and carried out specifically to serve his own goal of escaping Federation custody and destroying their government from the inside. This means Rick, in order to achieve something he personally wanted, was willing to cause the deaths of an unknown but clearly significant number of other Ricks, along with the Mortys living alongside them in the Citadel. These were not enemies in any direct sense. They were fellow members of the same organization Rick himself had helped build years earlier, living ordinary lives inside a city he had personally contributed to designing. Rick's plan treated all of them as acceptable losses, a necessary cost required to reach his own specific objective. The show frames this entire sequence as a moment of triumph for Rick rather than tragedy. The episode's structure builds toward this plan succeeding, showing Rick outsmarting the Federation, rescuing Morty and Summer from danger, and ultimately destroying the Federation's economy entirely through access gained during the chaos. Viewers are meant to feel a sense of victory watching this unfold, celebrating Rick's cleverness rather than dwelling on the number of other Ricks and
Mortys who died as a direct result of his specific choice to use the Citadel as a weapon against the Federation. This detail becomes especially significant when placed next to everything already established about the Citadel's population. These were not random strangers to Rick. They were people who shared his exact starting point in life, shaped into slightly different versions of the same basic person through different specific experiences. In a very real sense, killing large numbers of Citadel residents meant killing large numbers of people who were, structurally, extremely close to being Rick himself, just shaped by a different set of life events along the way. Rick's willingness to use these lives as an acceptable cost for his own escape plan lines up directly with patterns already examined throughout this series.
In the very first section, an entire planet full of people was left behind because fixing the damage caused by Rick's mistake required more effort than he wanted to spend. Here, an entire city full of alternate versions of himself becomes collateral damage in a plan built entirely around Rick's personal goals. First escaping prison, then bringing down an organization that had wronged him. The specific identity and survival of these other Ricks and Mortys does not appear to weigh heavily against Rick's calculations once he has decided on a course of action. The aftermath of this event adds another layer worth noting. Despite the scale of destruction caused, later material confirms the Citadel is eventually rebuilt, with a new government forming afterward and life continuing for the Ricks and Mortys who survived. This mirrors, in a much larger and more dramatic way, the exact same pattern already seen throughout this series. Something gets destroyed, sometimes through Rick's direct actions, and rather than requiring deep repair or reflection, life simply resumes in a rebuilt or replaced form shortly afterward. The Citadel's ability to recover so completely, with a new council forming and a functioning society continuing almost immediately, reinforces the same basic idea already explored in earlier sections. In this world, destruction rarely stays permanent, and the people affected by it are treated, both by the show's structure and by Rick's own actions, as replaceable enough that the story simply moves forward without dwelling on what was lost. There is also something worth noting about what this event reveals regarding Rick's actual view of his own uniqueness. If Rick truly believed there was something irreplaceable and singular about himself as an individual, the existence of thousands of nearly identical Ricks living inside the Citadel should have troubled him deeply. Instead, he treats large numbers of them as expendable the moment they become useful as cover for his own plan. This suggests Rick does not actually experience his own uniqueness as something fragile or threatened by the existence of so many similar versions of himself. He simply treats them the way he treats most other things examined throughout this series, as resources to be used or discarded depending on what serves his immediate goal. This willingness extends even further when you consider that Rick had already killed a significant number of alternate Ricks once before, during his original search for the one responsible for Diane and Beth's deaths. The Citadel disaster is not an isolated moment of uncharacteristic violence against his own duplicates. It fits into a longer pattern already established through Rick's own confirmed backstory, stretching back to before the Citadel even existed as an organized group. Rick has, at multiple points across his life, shown a consistent willingness to kill or endanger large numbers of other Ricks, whenever doing so served a goal important enough to him personally. None of this means Rick views these other Ricks as worthless in every situation. The show does establish, particularly through later material involving the Citadel's rebuilding efforts, that some level of shared identity and cooperation exists among different versions of Rick under normal circumstances. The peace agreement that led to the Citadel's original construction shows Rick was capable of working alongside other versions of himself when doing so served a mutual interest. What changes during the prison escape is that Rick's own personal goal, freedom from Federation custody and revenge against an organization he specifically hated, outweighed whatever cooperative relationship existed with the wider Citadel population at that specific moment. This willingness to treat cooperation as conditional, valuable only as long as it serves Rick's own specific goals, connects directly back to ideas already explored in earlier sections of this series. The love speech, examined in Section 4, framed romantic relationships as temporary chemical reactions rather than permanent bonds. The whiteboard scene, in Section 3, showed Rick treating his own grandchildren as interchangeable. The moment ending an argument became more convenient than actually engaging with either of their individual perspectives. Here, at a much larger scale, an entire community of people who share Rick's exact identity gets treated the same way, valuable as allies until a bigger personal goal makes their survival less important than achieving it. The specific target of Rick's plan also deserves attention. Rick did not simply escape prison through some method that avoided
avoid harming anyone else. He specifically chose a plan that required sacrificing the Citadel, an organization built partly through his own past cooperation, in order to also destroy the Galactic Federation at the same time. This detail shows Rick was not forced into this outcome by limited options. Among every possible method available to a person with his level of intelligence and resources, he selected the one that happened to require the deaths of large numbers of his own alternate selves as a direct part of achieving his goal. Taken together, everything confirmed about the Citadel across this episode reveals two connected truths about Rick. First, his claim to be uniquely brilliant does not hold up against the confirmed existence of thousands of equally capable versions of himself living ordinary lives just one dimension away. Second, despite this shared identity, Rick shows no meaningful hesitation about using large numbers of these near-identical versions of himself as an acceptable cost whenever his own specific goals require it. Being essentially the same person as thousands of others does not appear to create any special protection for those other versions when Rick's plans call for their sacrifice. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This raises a natural question about what actually drove Rick to accept sacrificing so many of his own duplicates and destroying an organization he had personally helped build. The specific reason Rick turned himself over to the Galactic Federation in the first place, and exactly what he gained from the resulting chaos beyond simple escape, is where the next section of this examination goes. That reason involves a much longer con than a straightforward prison break, one that reaches back into Rick's complicated history with his own family. Section 7, Turning Himself In, the Rick Shank Rickdemption Deception. Season 2 of the show ends with an episode called The Wedding Squanchers. The Smith family travels to a distant planet to attend the wedding of Bird Person, one of Rick's oldest friends, to a woman named Tammy. During the reception, Tammy reveals herself to be a deep cover agent working for the Galactic Federation, a powerful government organization that has hunted Rick for years. She shoots and kills Bird Person in front of the wedding guests, and Federation agents storm the event, forcing Rick and his family to flee. With nowhere left to run, Rick relocates his family to a tiny, isolated planet to hide from the Federation, which is now actively searching for him across known space. While hiding there, Rick overhears his family, particularly Beth, expressing how much they are willing to sacrifice, including their entire life back on Earth, just to stay together and avoid losing him again. Jerry, separately, is heard saying he thinks the family should turn Rick over to the Federation to end the situation, though the rest of the family firmly rejects this idea and defends Rick instead. After hearing his family's loyalty toward him laid out this openly, Rick makes a decision. He tells Morty he is going out for ice cream, then leaves and contacts the Galactic Federation directly, posing as Jerry to arrange the call. He turns himself in voluntarily on the condition that his family will be left alone and allowed to return safely to Earth. This decision appears, based purely on how the episode presents it, to be an act of real sacrifice, a moment where Rick chooses his family's safety and freedom over his own. The episode ends with Rick locked away in a maximum security Federation prison, seemingly for the rest of his life, while his family returns to an Earth that has now been absorbed into the Galactic Federation as one of its territories. Jerry is assigned a government job to pay off a debt for medication given to him during the takeover. The family adjusts to life without Rick, believing he has given up his freedom permanently to protect them. This appears to be the emotional high point of Rick's character up to this point in the show, a moment suggesting that underneath everything examined so far in this series, real love for his family does exist and is capable of overriding Rick's usual instincts towards self-preservation. The music playing during this sequence, a song called Hurt, reinforces this reading, framing Rick's decision as a genuine, costly act of love. Season 3 opens with an episode called The Rick Shank Rickdemption, and this episode reveals that the sacrifice shown at the end of Season 2 was not what it appeared to be. Rick did not turn himself in purely to protect his family. His arrest was the first step of a much larger plan, one built specifically to give him direct access to the Galactic Federation's most secure systems from the inside. While imprisoned, Rick is interrogated using a device that allows Federation scientists to view his memories directly, searching for the secret behind his portal gun technology. During this interrogation, Rick shows them a fabricated memory, suggesting his motivation for inventing interdimensional travel came from tragedy, the deaths of his wife Diane and daughter Beth. He later reveals this specific memory was invented on the spot, designed specifically to trick the interrogation technology into a vulnerability he could exploit to escape his restraints. Once free from the interrogation device, Rick begins executing
executing a series of moves that reveal turning himself in was never about surrendering at all. He transfers his mind into the body of one of the Federation's own elite soldiers, kills several other Ricks sent to assassinate him, and eventually gains access to the same citadel of Ricks examined directly in the previous section of this series. Using this access, Rick teleports the entire citadel directly into the same space as the Federation prison holding him, causing the massive collision and destruction already covered in detail earlier. In the chaos that follows this collision, Rick uses his access to reach the Federation's central financial systems. He alters the value of the Federation's currency, reducing it from its normal worth down to nothing. This single action collapses the Federation's entire economy almost instantly. Without a functioning currency, the government cannot pay its soldiers, cannot maintain its operations, and begins falling apart from the inside. The Federation's own president is shown taking his own life once the currency collapse becomes clear, and the organization that had ruled significant portions of known space for an unknown length of time crumbles within a very short period of time. This means Rick's supposed sacrifice at the end of Season 2 was, according to the show's own direct reveal at the start of Season 3, always intended to be temporary. He never planned to remain in Federation custody. Turning himself in was simply the method he chose to get close enough to the Federation's most secure systems to destroy them from within. The emotional framing given to his surrender in The Wedding Squanchers, presented at the time as genuine sacrifice for his family's safety, is revealed one episode later to have been a calculated first move in a much larger plan focused on revenge against an organization Rick had personal history with. This reveal changes how the entire earlier episode should be understood. Rick's family, along with the audience watching at the time, believe they were witnessing something rare, Rick choosing to give up his own freedom permanently out of love. What they were actually witnessing, based on the show's own later confirmation, was the opening move of a long con that required his family, and everyone else watching, to believe the sacrifice was real in order for the deception to work. If Rick's family had known his imprisonment was temporary and strategic, their genuine grief and adjustment to life without him would not have carried the same weight, and the Federation itself might have grown suspicious of how easily Rick accepted capture. This means the emotional pain experienced by Beth, Morty, and Summer throughout the time Rick spent in custody was, in part, a necessary ingredient in a plan Rick had already set in motion before ever turning himself in. Their genuine sadness and adjustment to a Rickless household served a purpose within Rick's actual goal, helping maintain the illusion that his surrender was sincere. The show does not state directly that Rick calculated his family's grief as part of the plan on purpose, but the structure of events confirms their belief in his sincerity was necessary for the plan to succeed without the Federation catching on early. After destroying the Federation, Rick returns home a hero in the eyes of Summer and Beth, who celebrate what he has accomplished. Jerry, however, is left in a difficult position. Earlier in the same episode, Jerry is shown considering turning Rick in to the Federation, a betrayal Rick becomes aware of during the same events. Once Rick returns home successful, Jerry issues Beth an ultimatum, asking her to choose between staying married to him or continuing to allow Rick to live in their household. Beth chooses her father, and Jerry leaves, beginning a period of separation between Beth and Jerry that continues across the following season. The Season 3 finale, an episode called The Rickchurian Morty Date, reveals the deeper layer sitting underneath this entire outcome. In this episode, Rick tells Morty directly that his true goal throughout the Season 3 premiere was never only about destroying the Federation. He also wanted to remove Jerry from the household permanently, using the fallout from his return as a hero to manipulate Beth into choosing him over her own husband. Rick openly states that both the Federation and Jerry needed to be dealt with, and that the events which unfolded, the Federation's collapse and Jerry and Beth's separation, both serve that same underlying purpose. This confirms that Rick's plan, set into motion the moment he turned himself in during the Wedding Squanchers, was built around two separate goals from the very beginning. One goal involved destroying an organization Rick had personal history and conflict with. The other goal involved removing a family member Rick personally disliked and saw as a rival for his daughter's attention and loyalty. Both of these outcomes required Rick's family and the audience to first believe his surrender was a genuine act of love and sacrifice, then to believe his eventual heroism upon return was simply the natural result of his own cleverness, rather than a plan targeting his own son-in-law from the very start. Jerry's reaction to this eventual reveal, along with his ongoing separation from Beth, plays out across the following season. In the show's fourth season, material confirms that Jerry and Beth do eventually reconcile, complicating the long-term success of Rick's manipulation, though the immediate result at the end of Season 3 matches exactly what
what Rick states he wanted: Jerry removed from the household, and Beth choosing to keep her father close instead. What makes this entire sequence of events significant to this examination is how deeply it undercuts the emotional weight given to Rick's supposed sacrifice at the end of Season 2. A viewer watching The Wedding Squanchers for the first time is meant to feel that Rick has finally shown real vulnerability, real love, real willingness to lose everything for his family's sake. The very next episode confirms that none of this vulnerability was genuine in the way it first appeared. Rick's tears, his goodbye to Morty under the pretense of getting ice cream, his quiet decision to sacrifice his freedom, all of it served a larger strategic goal that had nothing to do with pure selfless love and everything to do with revenge against an organization and a family member who had both, in different ways, wronged him. This connects directly to patterns already established throughout earlier sections of this series. Rick's love speech in Section 4 framed romantic connection as nothing more than temporary chemical reaction, destined to fade and disappoint. Here, an entire arc built around Rick appearing to sacrifice everything for family love is revealed to be a carefully engineered deception, using his family's genuine emotions as tools inside a larger plan Rick had already decided to carry out, regardless of how his family actually felt about it. The appearance of deep love and connection, in both cases, turns out to be something Rick is willing to construct or manipulate whenever doing so serves his actual goals. The Citadel destruction, examined in the previous section, becomes even more significant once placed alongside this reveal. Rick did not simply destroy the Citadel and the Federation as an unavoidable side effect of escaping prison. He specifically engineered his own capture, allowed his family to genuinely grieve his apparent sacrifice, and built an elaborate plan requiring the deaths of large numbers of his own alternate selves, all in service of two personal goals: revenge against the Federation and the removal of Jerry from his daughter's household. Neither goal required public knowledge to succeed. Both required deception, patience, and Rick's willingness to let people who loved him believe something false for an extended period of time. This detail also reframes something noted earlier about the Citadel's destruction. The Ricks and Mortys who died during that collision were not simply an unfortunate cost of Rick's escape. They were part of the cost of a plan aimed partly at settling a personal grudge against his own son-in-law. The scale of destruction involved: an entire city of alternate selves, killed in service of a plan that included getting rid of Jerry, shows exactly how far Rick was willing to go, and how many other lives he was willing to spend in pursuit of goals that were, at least in part, deeply personal, rather than purely necessary for survival. Beth's role throughout this entire sequence is worth noting as well. She is shown celebrating Rick's return as a hero, unaware that part of the reason her marriage fell apart in that exact moment was because her own father had engineered the circumstances specifically to produce that outcome. She chooses Rick over Jerry, believing this to be her own independent decision, made freely based on her own feelings and loyalty. The show's own later reveal confirms Rick had already worked to shape the exact circumstances that led to this choice, using his family's genuine emotions, including his daughter's love and loyalty toward him, as tools inside a plan she had no knowledge of. This entire arc, stretching from a single episode presented as heartbreaking sacrifice through to a full season finale confirming that sacrifice as a strategic deception with personal motives attached, gives some of the clearest evidence found anywhere in the show for how Rick's stated worldview and his actual behavior line up. He does not need to believe love and family connection are meaningless in order to manipulate those exact feelings for his own benefit. He simply treats them as tools, useful when they serve a goal he has already decided matters more, disposable in terms of honesty and transparency the moment revealing the truth would put that goal at risk. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section moves away from Rick's manipulation of people around him and looks directly at a moment where Rick is forced to face himself with no one else in the room to manipulate and no larger plan to hide behind. In a Season 3 episode, Rick transforms himself into a pickle specifically to avoid a single scheduled family therapy session, setting off a chain of events that ends with him sitting across from a therapist who sees through him completely. Section 8, Pickle Rick, Avoidance Engineered as Competence. The third episode of Season 3 is called Pickle Rick. The episode opens with Beth having scheduled a family therapy session, one she believes is important given everything the family has gone through, including the divorce examined in the previous section of this series. Rick does not want to attend this session. Rather than simply refusing to go or offering an excuse, he builds a device that turns his own body into a pickle, then uses it on himself
himself right before the family is set to leave for the appointment. Rick's stated reason for doing this, according to what he tells Morty afterward, is that turning himself into a pickle seemed like an interesting scientific challenge, something worth doing simply because he could. He does not initially frame it as an act of avoidance. He presents it as a fun, impressive display of his own abilities, transforming his body into a small pickle and somehow remaining alive and capable of movement despite having no visible mouth, limbs, or normal biological functions. The problem is that Rick did not think through what would happen once he was actually in pickle form, sitting on the kitchen counter at the exact moment the family needs to leave for therapy. Morty discovers him this way, sitting motionless where he was left, unable to change himself back because he built the device to only work in one direction. Rather than admitting he made a mistake or asking for help finding a way to reverse the transformation, Rick tells Morty to simply carry him along to the session as he currently is, in pickle form, planning to sit through the appointment without ever revealing what actually happened. Once at the therapist's office, things do not go as planned. While being carried inside, the pickle version of Rick ends up falling out of Morty's jacket pocket and rolling into a floor drain, getting flushed down into the sewer system running underneath the building. This begins the actual survival sequence that makes up most of the episode, all of it happening because Rick avoided simply telling his family he did not want to attend therapy. Trapped in the sewer with no limbs, no mouth, and no obvious way to move or defend himself, Rick is left to survive using only what his mind can figure out from his current situation. The show spends an extended stretch of the episode with almost no dialogue at all during this sequence, choosing instead to let the visuals carry the story. Rick, as a pickle, is shown thinking rapidly, working out how to use whatever is available to him in the sewer environment to survive an area filled with rats and other creatures that clearly see him as food. Rick manages to kill a group of rats using improvised methods built entirely out of whatever he can find in the sewer, then uses the bodies and parts of these rats to construct a crude, functioning exoskeleton around his pickle form. This exoskeleton gives him the ability to move, to grip objects, and eventually to fight, all built from raw survival instinct and rapid engineering under pressure, without a single word of dialogue needed to explain what he is doing. The sequence is presented as genuinely impressive from a pure survival and problem-solving standpoint, showing exactly how capable Rick is, even when reduced to one of the most vulnerable physical forms imaginable. As the episode continues, Rick's survival inside the sewer eventually draws him into contact with a much larger and more dangerous situation. He is captured by an assassin working for a criminal organization, taken to a facility where prisoners are being used for various purposes, and forced into direct combat against heavily armed guards. Using the makeshift rat exoskeleton and whatever weapons and tools he can improvise along the way, Rick fights his way through this entire facility, defeating trained combatants and escaping certain danger multiple times, all while still trapped in the physical body of a pickle. By the end of this sequence, Rick has survived a sewer system, built his own working body out of rat parts, defeated an assassin, and fought through an entire armed compound, arriving at the therapist's office covered in blood and debris from everything he has just been through. He walks in exactly on time for the tail end of the scheduled family session, having gone through what is presented as an extraordinarily dangerous and difficult ordeal, purely as a direct result of his own decision earlier that day to avoid a conversation by turning himself into a vegetable instead. This is where the episode shifts its focus toward the actual point being made underneath all of the action and survival material shown throughout the middle section. Beth's therapist, a character named Dr. Wong, is present for Rick's arrival and has, by this point, already heard about what happened from the rest of the family. Rather than being impressed or alarmed purely by the physical danger Rick survived, Dr. Wong focuses her attention on why any of this happened in the first place. She directly addresses Rick, stating plainly that what he has just described to her, turning himself into a pickle rather than simply saying he did not want to attend a therapy session, is a significant amount of effort and danger accepted purely to avoid a conversation. She tells him that the fact he would rather survive an ordeal this extreme rather than sit through a single session of therapy says something important about him. She goes on to explain that Rick's transformation into a pickle was not really about proving he could do something impressive scientifically. It was about avoiding a situation where he would have to sit still, be examined honestly, and answer questions about himself that he does not want to answer. This assessment is delivered calmly and directly, without hesitation, and Rick does not offer a strong counterargument in response. Given how quick Rick is throughout the rest of the show to argue, deflect, or outsmart nearly everyone he interacts with, his lack of a real comeback in this specific moment stands out clearly. He does not dismiss what Dr. Wong says as wrong. He does not immediately turn the conversation conversation into a joke the way he does in most other emotionally difficult situations throughout the series. He simply sits there and takes in what she has told him, offering only a small amount of pushback before the conversation moves forward. Dr. Wong continues, telling Rick directly that she believes he is an extremely capable person, someone who would likely survive almost any physical challenge placed in front of him, including something as extreme as an apocalypse. She also tells him that being this capable does not necessarily make him happy, and that his choice to spend an entire day surviving a sewer and an armed compound rather than facing a single conversation about his own feelings suggests he finds physical danger easier to handle than emotional honesty. This scene gives some of the clearest, most direct evidence found anywhere in the show regarding how Rick actually processes difficult emotional situations. Rather than confronting something uncomfortable directly, he builds an elaborate, dangerous, physically demanding alternative to avoid it entirely. The choice to turn himself into a pickle was never really about proving scientific ability, despite how Rick initially frames it to Morty. It was, according to the therapist's direct assessment inside the show itself, a way of avoiding therapy entirely by making himself physically incapable of participating in it. This connects clearly to patterns already established throughout earlier sections of this series. Rick has already been shown throughout this examination choosing distraction and avoidance over direct confrontation with difficult realities multiple times. In Section 1, an entire ruined planet was left behind rather than repaired. In Section 5, Morty offered television as a way to move past a painful realization rather than sitting with it directly. Here, in a much more extreme and literal way, Rick builds an entire elaborate ordeal for himself specifically to avoid 1 hour of direct emotional engagement with a professional trained to help him process whatever he might be dealing with internally. The scale of what Rick is willing to go through in order to avoid this single conversation is worth sitting with directly. He does not simply skip the appointment or make an excuse. He alters his own physical body into a form with no natural ability to defend itself, survives an environment filled with predators, builds a functioning body out of parts of dead animals, fights through an entire team of armed guards, and does all of this rather than simply telling his family he does not want to talk about his feelings in a therapist's office. The amount of effort and danger involved in avoidance, compared to the actual difficulty of the thing being avoided, highlights exactly how far Rick is willing to go rather than face a direct, honest conversation about himself. This detail becomes even more significant when you consider Rick's general reputation throughout the rest of the show as someone who fears very little. He regularly faces down powerful enemies, dangerous creatures, and life-threatening situations without much visible hesitation or fear. Yet, according to the therapist's direct assessment, an ordinary conversation about his own emotional state is something he finds difficult enough to avoid through an act this extreme. This suggests Rick's fearlessness does not extend equally into every part of his life. Physical danger, however severe, appears to be something he can handle without much internal struggle. Direct emotional honesty about himself appears to be a much harder challenge for him to face. Dr. Wong's assessment does not attempt to diagnose Rick with any specific condition or offer him a simple solution to fix this pattern. She simply names what she observes plainly and directly, without softening it or offering easy comfort. Rick, for his part, does not fully accept or fully reject what she tells him within the scene. He listens, offers a brief response, and the episode moves toward its ending without a clear resolution showing Rick having learned a lasting lesson from the encounter. This lack of resolution fits a pattern already noted multiple times throughout this series. The show consistently presents these kinds of direct, revealing moments about Rick's character without following them up with a clear character arc showing meaningful change as a result. The whiteboard scene in Section 3, the love speech in Section 4, the manipulation revealed in Section 7, all of these moments reveal something significant about how Rick operates, without the show necessarily showing Rick learning from or growing past any of it in a lasting, permanent way. What makes the Pickle Rick episode particularly useful for this specific examination is how directly it names the avoidance pattern out loud, through a character positioned specifically to observe and assess Rick's behavior from an outside, professional perspective. Everything examined in earlier sections of this series required piecing together evidence from Rick's actions and words scattered across many different episodes. Here, an entire episode is built specifically around demonstrating this exact pattern, then has a character directly explain what that pattern means, all within a single, continuous story. The physical transformation into a pickle also works as a clear symbol for something the therapist's assessment makes explicit. By turning himself into a pickle, Rick makes himself something small, sealed off, difficult to reach, and incapable of speaking or being easily understood by anyone around
around him. This matches closely with how Rick generally handles emotional topics throughout the rest of the series, staying difficult to read, quick to deflect with humor or science, rarely allowing anyone, including his own family, direct access to how he actually feels about anything happening around him. The choice to have Rick survive using pieces of dead rats, building a new body for himself out of the remains of other living things, adds another layer worth noting. Rather than finding a way to return to his original form and simply admit what happened, Rick constructs an entirely new, functional version of himself using whatever raw material is available, moving forward without needing to reverse or repair the actual problem underneath his situation. This mirrors, in a very literal and visual way, patterns already established throughout earlier sections examined in this series, where problems get worked around and rebuilt from, rather than directly solved or reversed. By the time Rick finally reaches the therapist's office, exhausted and covered in the aftermath of everything he has just survived, the actual scheduled therapy session is nearly over. He has spent an entire day undergoing an extraordinarily dangerous ordeal, arriving just in time to hear a brief but direct assessment of exactly why he put himself through all of it in the first place. The irony of this outcome is not subtle. Rick's attempt to avoid therapy through extreme action results in him receiving one of the most direct, unfiltered pieces of insight about his own behavior found anywhere in the entire show, delivered by the exact professional he built an entire elaborate escape specifically to avoid. This episode, taken as a whole, adds a new dimension to everything already established throughout this examination. The earlier sections showed Rick avoiding consequences, treating people as replaceable, manipulating those closest to him, and destroying organizations built around his own alternate selves. This episode shows something slightly different, a direct, confirmed pattern of avoiding emotional honesty about himself specifically, even when the physical alternative involves genuine, extreme danger. Rick appears more willing to risk his own life in a sewer than to sit still and answer honest questions about his own internal state. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next section moves directly into the source of whatever Rick might be avoiding when faced with those kinds of questions. Season 3 eventually reveals what actually happened to Rick's original family, confirming, through later material, exactly why a man capable of surviving nearly anything might still find a single conversation about his own feelings harder to face than almost anything else the universe has thrown at him so far. Section 9. The Real Origin. Diane and Beth's Murder. The Season 3 premiere, The Rick Shank Rickdemption, examined already in earlier sections of this series, for its role in destroying the Galactic Federation and the Citadel of Ricks, also contains the first direct look at where Rick's story actually began. During Rick's interrogation by Federation scientists, viewers are shown a memory sequence depicting Rick as a much younger scientist, working on early teleportation technology alongside his wife Diane and young daughter Beth. In this memory, a different, more experienced version of Rick appears, one who has already discovered a working method for interdimensional travel. This alternate Rick offers to share the secret of full multiversal travel with the younger Rick, inviting him to join a group of other Ricks who have already achieved this same breakthrough across their own versions of reality. The younger Rick, shown in this memory as content with his current life and his family, declines the offer. He tells the visiting Rick he would rather continue his current path, choosing his family over joining this wider group of interdimensional travelers. Shortly after this refusal, a bomb is sent through a portal directly into the younger Rick's home. The explosion kills his wife Diane and his young daughter Beth. This event is shown as the direct trigger for everything that follows. The reason the show's Rick eventually invents his own version of the portal gun, setting him on the path toward becoming the character audiences have followed since the beginning of the series. At the time this memory is originally shown, Rick tells his interrogator it is entirely fabricated. He claims he invented the entire story on the spot, including the deaths of Diane and Beth, purely to trick the Federation's mind-reading device into a vulnerability he could exploit to escape captivity. For years following this episode's original broadcast, the show does not confirm or deny whether any part of this story actually happened. Fans debated this question extensively, uncertain whether Rick truly experienced this tragedy or whether the entire account really was invented purely as an escape tactic. The show eventually gives a direct answer to this question. In the 5th season, an episode called Rick Mirai Jack shows Morty gaining access to an actual scan of Rick's memories, separate from the fabricated version shown to Federation interrogators years earlier. This scan reveals real, unaltered memories rather than anything constructed for strategic purposes. According to what these memories show, the core events depicted in the original fabricated story were in fact true. Rick's wife Diane and his daughter Beth really were killed, and the circumstances matched closely with what had been shown years earlier, aside from a few smaller specific details that differed between the two versions. This confirmation changes how every other piece of Rick's behavior across the entire series should be understood. Rick's fabricated memory was not really a lie built from nothing. It was closer to a story built around real events, adjusted slightly and reframed for strategic purposes during his interrogation, but grounded in genuine tragedy rather than pure invention. The show confirms this distinction directly through the Season 5 reveal, closing a mystery that had remained open since the Season 3 premiere first aired. Additional details about what happened after this tragedy come from further material revealed across Seasons 5 and 6. According to this material, the Rick responsible for the deaths of Diane and Beth was not simply some random or unknown attacker. He was eventually identified as a specific alternate version of Rick, referred to throughout the show as Rick Prime, originating from a dimension separate from the one the main Rick grew up in. Rick Prime is confirmed as the individual who delivered the bomb that killed Diane and Beth, acting out of anger after the younger Rick refused his offer to join the wider group of interdimensional travelers. Following the deaths of his wife and daughter, Rick did not immediately build the portal gun the way the original fabricated memory suggested. According to the more detailed, confirmed version of events revealed later, Rick was taken to receive medical treatment for injuries sustained during the explosion, then spent an unspecified period of time living alone before eventually returning to his scientific work and completing the portal gun on his own terms. This detail adds a layer of accuracy the earlier fabricated version had smoothed over, showing an actual recovery period rather than an immediate leap directly from tragedy into invention. Once the portal gun was completed, Rick began a search across the multiverse specifically to locate Rick Prime, the version of himself responsible for the deaths of Diane and Beth. This search is confirmed, through material referenced already in earlier sections of this series, to have involved Rick killing a significant number of other alternate Ricks along the way, unable to immediately identify which one, if any, was the specific Rick he was looking for. This search eventually led to the formation of the Citadel of Ricks, examined in detail in Section 6, as other Ricks banded together for protection against a version of themselves who had become dangerous and unpredictable in his pursuit of vengeance. The full resolution of this search does not arrive until much later in the show's run. Confirmed material from later seasons shows Rick finally locating and confronting Rick Prime directly, ending a search that had stretched across an extended and largely unspecified length of time. This confrontation results in Rick Prime's death at the hands of the main Rick the show has followed throughout its entire run, closing out a storyline that had technically been running underneath the series since its earliest episodes, even before viewers were given any direct information about it. During this final confrontation, additional information is revealed about just how far Rick Prime had gone in trying to prevent Rick from ever recovering what he lost. According to confirmed material from this storyline, Rick Prime used technology capable of erasing every version of Diane across the entire multiverse, ensuring that no Rick anywhere, in any dimension, could ever find a version of her still alive. This detail explains something that had puzzled many viewers throughout the earlier seasons: why Rick never simply traveled to a dimension where Diane had survived, given how easily the show demonstrates travel between nearly identical alternate realities elsewhere. According to this specific reveal, that option had already been permanently removed by Rick Prime, specifically to prevent it. This piece of information adds significant weight to nearly every pattern already examined throughout this series. In Section 1, Rick swapped into a nearly identical replacement family without hesitation after the Cronenberg disaster destroyed his previous version of Earth. In Section 2, this examination noted that Rick eventually settled into a dimension where Beth had been abandoned by her original father, rather than continuing his search for any version of his actual original family. Now, with this additional confirmed detail, it becomes clear this was not simply Rick choosing convenience over effort. The specific family he originally lost, Diane included, had been made permanently unreachable across the entire multiverse by the very enemy he had spent years hunting. This context reframes the replacement pattern examined throughout earlier sections of this series in an important way. Rick's willingness to slide into nearly identical replacement families is not purely a sign of emotional detachment or indifference toward the specific people he has lost. According to this confirmed backstory, at least part of his behavior stems from the fact that recovering what he actually lost had already been made impossible by someone else's direct direct action, closing off an option that might have otherwise been available to him given the tools he has access to. At the same time, this added context does not fully erase the patterns examined throughout this series.
Rick still chose, according to confirmed events in Solarix, to settle specifically into a family missing a father, rather than continuing to search for any other path forward. He still built an entire section of the multiverse, the central finite curve, specifically designed to protect his own sense of superiority, rather than focusing that same effort purely on locating Rick Prime more efficiently. He still, as shown throughout sections 6 and 7 of this examination, treated large numbers of his own alternate selves and members of his own family as expendable, whenever doing so served whatever goal he had prioritized at that specific moment. What this confirmed origin story does provide is a clear, direct explanation for the emotional avoidance examined in the previous section of this series. Dr. Wong's assessment of Rick during the events of Pickle Rick, that he finds physical danger easier to face than honest emotional conversation, makes significantly more sense once placed next to this confirmed backstory. A person who lost his wife and young daughter to a targeted attack, then spent years traveling across the multiverse killing versions of himself while searching for the one responsible, has a specific, confirmed reason for finding direct emotional honesty more difficult than nearly any physical challenge the universe can present him with. This connects directly back to the whiteboard scene examined in section 3 of this series as well. Rick's willingness to treat his own grandchildren as statistically equal and largely interchangeable takes on a different shade once you understand that the family he currently lives with is, according to confirmed events, a replacement for the family he actually lost. His comfort with treating Morty and Summer as somewhat replaceable may connect to the fact that, from his own perspective, he has already lived through losing an entire family once, then found himself settling into a new one that was never fully his to begin with in the same original sense. The love speech examined in section 4 gains additional weight from this same context. Rick's claim that love is simply chemical reaction destined to fade and disappoint was delivered to Morty in the very first season of the show, years before any of this backstory had been confirmed to audiences. Knowing now that Rick had already lost a wife and daughter to violence before ever meeting the family the show actually follows, his bitter framing of love as something temporary and disappointing reads less like abstract cynicism and more like a direct reflection of his own confirmed personal history. This backstory also adds meaning to the manipulation examined in section 7, where Rick used his family's genuine love and loyalty as tools inside a larger plan targeting both the Galactic Federation and Jerry specifically. A person who has already experienced losing an entire family once, then spent years hunting across the multiverse in response, may have a different relationship with trust and vulnerability than someone without this specific history. This does not excuse the manipulation examined in that section, but it does provide confirmed context for why someone with Rick's specific history might default to strategic deception rather than open honesty, even with people he has chosen to live alongside for years. The confirmation of this backstory across seasons 3, 5, and 6 represents one of the longest-running mysteries in the entire show's history, stretching from an unconfirmed, seemingly fabricated story shown briefly in a single episode, all the way to a fully resolved, multi-season storyline involving Rick Prime's eventual death. Very few pieces of information revealed anywhere in the show carry this much confirmed weight, built up gradually across multiple seasons, rather than delivered all at once in a single episode. Taken together with everything already examined throughout this series, this origin story does not soften or excuse the patterns of avoidance, manipulation, and detachment already documented across every previous section. It does, however, provide a confirmed, canon-based explanation for where those patterns originally came from. Rick was not simply born detached from consequence, or incapable of processing loss. According to the show's own confirmed timeline, he experienced a specific, devastating loss at a young age, watched an enemy specifically ensure that loss could never be reversed anywhere in the multiverse, then spent years responding to that reality in ways that eventually shaped every pattern examined throughout the rest of this series. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This raises a final question this examination has not yet fully addressed. If Rick truly processed this loss the way his general behavior throughout the show suggests, treating grief as something to work around rather than face directly, why did he keep an entire separate dimension frozen in place for decades, trapped at the exact moment he lost Diane and Beth, unable to fully release it even while living an entirely different life elsewhere? That specific detail, confirmed
confirmed through the events of Solarix, is where this examination goes next. Section 10, the time loop he couldn't leave. Solarix. Season 5 contains an episode called Solarix, and this episode reveals one of the most direct pieces of evidence anywhere in the show showing that Rick's detachment from loss is not as complete as most of his other behavior throughout the series suggests. This episode brings Rick and Morty back to Rick's original home dimension, the same dimension where Diane and Beth were killed, confirmed as real events through the backstory examined in the previous section of this series. Rick and Morty travel to this dimension, searching for information that might help them deal with Rick Prime, the specific alternate version of Rick confirmed as responsible for the deaths of Diane and Beth. While there, the episode reveals something about this dimension that had never been shown or mentioned before. The entire dimension has been kept frozen in time, stuck at the exact moment Rick lost his wife and daughter, for what the show indicates has been a period stretching across decades. This means every person living in this specific dimension has been trapped, repeating the same day over and over, unable to move forward in time for an extended stretch of years. The show specifically shows one recurring background character from this dimension, a neighbor named Mr. Goldenfold, sometimes referred to by a longer name in supporting material, still stuck living through the same repeating period, unaware that decades have effectively passed while he remains locked in place. Rick is directly responsible for this time loop. The show confirms this plainly rather than leaving it as something the audience needs to guess at. Rick built and maintained this loop himself, specifically anchored to the day he lost Diane and Beth, keeping the entire dimension frozen at that exact point, rather than allowing it to continue forward naturally the way every other dimension shown throughout the series does. This detail stands in direct contrast to nearly every pattern examined throughout the earlier sections of this series. In Section 1, an entire ruined planet was left behind, without any attempt to freeze it in place or preserve it in any way. In Section 2, Rick eventually settled into a completely different family, rather than continuing to search for any trace of his original one. Yet here, in this one specific dimension, Rick did the opposite of walking away entirely. He kept it exactly as it was, unable or unwilling to let this particular piece of his past move forward the way everything else in his life around him has been allowed to. The reason behind Rick maintaining this loop becomes clearer through what happens next in the episode. As part of the events of Solarix, Rick makes the decision to finally end the time loop, allowing this frozen dimension to move forward in time after decades of being held in place. This decision is presented directly within the episode as a meaningful, difficult step for Rick to take, something that requires a level of acceptance he had clearly been avoiding for a very long time. Ending the loop has significant consequences for the people who had been trapped inside it. Mr. Goldenfold, having been kept from aging or dying naturally for decades due to the frozen dimension, is shown facing the natural passage of time all at once the loop ends. The show presents this specific outcome as something close to a release rather than a tragedy, framing decades of unnatural suspension finally being allowed to resolve naturally as a kind of relief for someone who had been kept artificially frozen against the normal order of things for far longer than should have been possible. This detail matters directly to understanding what the time loop actually represented for Rick personally. Keeping this dimension frozen was not simply a random technical choice or an accidental side effect of some other action Rick had taken. According to how the episode frames it, the loop existed specifically because Rick had not been ready to let go of the exact moment his original family was taken from him. Ending it required Rick reaching a point where he could finally allow that specific moment to become the past rather than something artificially held in an endless present. This stands as one of the clearest pieces of direct evidence anywhere in the show that Rick's relationship with loss is more complicated than his general behavior throughout the rest of the series suggests. Nearly every pattern examined throughout this entire examination, the willingness to abandon ruined worlds, the ease of settling into replacement families, the treatment of his own alternate selves as expendable, all of it pointed toward a character who processes loss by moving past it quickly, often without visible struggle. This episode reveals that at least one loss, the specific one connected to Diane and his original Beth, was never actually processed or moved past at all. It was simply frozen, quite literally, kept from ever needing to be fully faced. This detail forces a more complete understanding of everything already examined throughout this series. Rick's apparent detachment does not appear to come from a genuine absence of deep feeling about loss. According to what Solarix confirms directly, at least one loss affected him deeply enough that he built an entire elaborate system specifically to avoid ever having to let it fully become the past. The nihilistic patterns examined throughout sections 1 through 8 of this series: the swapping of ruined worlds, the mathematical dismissal of his own grandchildren's individuality, the framing of love as disposable chemistry, the manipulation of his own family's genuine emotions. All of these behaviors exist alongside this one confirmed exception: a single dimension kept frozen for decades because letting it move forward meant finally accepting that Diane and his original Beth were truly gone. This connects directly back to the therapist's assessment examined in Section 8 of this series. Dr. Wong told Rick directly that he seemed to find physical danger easier to face than honest emotional engagement with himself.
The time loop revealed in Solarix provides confirmed, direct evidence supporting exactly this assessment. Rather than working through his grief over Diane and his original Beth the way a person might through therapy or direct emotional processing, Rick chose instead to freeze an entire dimension in place, avoiding the natural passage of time itself rather than facing what that passage of time would eventually require him to accept. The decision to finally end the loop during the events of Solarix suggests some amount of change or growth on Rick's part, at least in this one specific area. Maintaining a frozen dimension for decades, then finally choosing to let it move forward, represents a direct, active choice to stop avoiding something Rick had clearly been avoiding for an extremely long time. This does not erase or undo any of the patterns examined throughout the rest of this series. It does show that even a character built around consistent avoidance and detachment is capable of eventually facing at least one piece of what he has spent so much effort avoiding. This final piece of evidence completes a picture that has been building steadily across every section of this examination. Rick Sanchez is a character whose actions, confirmed directly through the show's own canon, repeatedly demonstrate detachment from consequence, replaceability of relationships, and avoidance of direct emotional honesty. An entire planet gets abandoned rather than repaired. An entire multiverse gets treated as a source of endless replacement copies for anything lost. Grandchildren get reduced to mathematically equal disappointments. Love gets redefined as disposable chemistry. Manipulation replaces honesty even in moments framed as genuine sacrifice. Physical danger gets chosen over a single therapy session. Yet running underneath every one of these confirmed patterns sits one dimension, kept frozen for decades, existing as direct proof that at least one loss mattered enough to Rick that he could not simply walk away from it the way he walked away from nearly everything else examined throughout this entire series. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.